Okay, the next thing I'm going to talk about is secure coding concepts. And really what we're talking about here is application development and the balancing act between time to market and security. If you're in development or if you've been around developers, it's always, quick, quick, quick. We have to get there immediately. The first person to the dance, so to speak, wins, right? The time to market, speed to market is imperative for either a differentiation or some type of competitive advantage. So when we're building applications and we're coding for these types of things, security often will take kind of a back seat. All right. It's viewed as a necessary evil. So it adds to development time and ultimately reduces or increases, I should say, that time to market. So it's critical, though, to really kind of keep this in perspective. If we don't have time to find the vulnerabilities, then the bad guys will. All right. So if you don't have time to do it right the first time, how are you going to have time to go back and redo it? Perhaps a second or a third or a fourth time. Not to mention the lack in consumer confidence or the damage to the company, loss of data, et cetera, et cetera. So application development and that coding is critical. And there are a couple concepts that we need to be aware of, all right? And that is the concept of error and exception handling. So when we write our code, when we write the applications, all right, and I don't necessarily expect you to be a developer at this point, but you need to have a security mindset. And you need to, when you're interacting with developers, when you're interacting with management, when you're interacting with other areas within your company, you always have to have that security mindset in play. Okay, it's critical that we approach things this way because not everybody thinks with a security mindset, right? As I mentioned, sometimes, or a lot of times actually, depending upon the company, security takes a back seat. It never fails. They see the security guy walking down the hallway and everybody kind of scatters and goes the opposite direction. They don't want to necessarily hear the buzzkill coming in saying, oh, guys, we need to lock this down. We need to lock that down. Are you looking at this and looking at that? You have to just make sure that we communicate with everybody with the mindset of, are you testing? Are you understanding how the application fails? Because it will fail no matter how well it's written, no matter how good the programming is. At some point in time, given enough time, hackers, if they sit there and bang away all day at it, will find some way or some method to get into that application. So the error and exception handling is, what does the application do when it encounters an error? Does it continue running? Does it restart a process or a module, or does it completely crash? And really, depending upon the attacker's motives, they may want to simply get in and get access to a website. They may want to crash it completely to see if they can get some type of elevated privilege and get into the kind of a backdoor into that system, which may then lead them into other systems within your environment. We want to code and make sure that we're gracefully erroring out so that when we pass an error, we don't give too much information to the attacker or to the end user. We simply say an error as encountered and not something that gives us all this information as to what may have happened, because that just gives an attacker that much more information to basically fingerprint that application and to fingerprint what's happening behind the scenes, all right? So ultimately, as I mentioned, we're giving keys to the castle if an application crashes and gives away too much information. So the other thing is input validation. So when we have a web form, let's just say, for instance, it is a web application, whether it's signing up for an email or whether it's signing up for a mailing list, or it could be actually checking out and putting in your information, your credit card, your mailing address, and so on and so forth. That input validation needs to be validated and it needs to be sanitized so that when it's entered, it doesn't necessarily, or it doesn't have the opportunity, I should say, for an attacker to put in malicious code and crash the system. All right, so it will mitigate such attacks as cross-site scripting or SQL injection attacks. All right, now there are some applications you'll see on the right, Metasploit, Exploit Me, and there's some add-ons for Firefox, NetSparker, and then of course all the ones I showed you within Kali Linux. There are a lot of tools out there that will allow both malicious and non-malicious or white hat and black hat hackers to basically go out and capitalize on those vulnerabilities. So input validation is critical. We have to sanitize that data before it gets passed on to the server. Okay, another thing with secure coding are two references I want to draw your attention to. One is OWASP or OWASP, and that's the Open Web Application Security Project. And you see the link here basically gives you some secure coding best practices and a quick reference guide. And then CERT also has one as well for secure coding. So I just want to bring your attention to those two references so you can go in and get some additional information if you are so inclined to read up on secure coding concepts in a little more detail. As I mentioned before, when we were talking about impersonation, a replay attack captures packets and puts them back on the wire. You can impersonate someone, or you can simply capture those packets, manipulate them in some fashion, and then put them back on the wire, retransmit them to look like legitimate packets. Now, as I mentioned again previously as well, sequencing will help mitigate the effectiveness of that type of an attack. So, as an example, here we have two people, good old Bob and Alice. They've been friends forever, it seems. Almost since the dawn of the computer age, these two have been going back and forth. So we have some network that they're communicating over. They want to communicate back and forth. Well, lo and behold, here we have Harry the hacker. He pops in and he's going to intercept that communication. So now Bob is actually communicating with Harry the hacker when in fact he thinks he's communicating with Alice. Harry the hacker will then communicate back and forth with Alice. Both of them, however, think they're communicating with each other. That replay attack allows that man in the middle scenario where that person is intercepting packets from both sides, manipulating them in some fashion and replaying them on the network. Okay, the next thing is cross-site request forgery, or XSRF, sometimes referred to as CSRF or CSRF. And this is basically exploiting a website's trust in a user, whether it's an application, IP address, etc. So it's often referred to as a one-click attack or session riding. Okay, and I mentioned it's pronounced CSRF. So it requires the victim to have recently visited the target website and have a valid cookie that's not expired. So XSRF example would be that we have an attacker. They're going to basically give you a link, visit PoorYou, as in this example, right, .com. So that user, the victim, will click on that link. They'll go within their browser to the attacker server because it's a malicious link, remember. So they're going to go to PoorYou.com. They're going to get a response back. That response is going to contain an invisible form that is going to have the ability to pull the cookie and the credentials off of that user's session and then post to a specific bank server in this example. And it will do so with that victim, right, the target's credentials. So this is more or less a very specific type of an attack. It's not going to be widespread, obviously. The attacker kind of has to know or just kind of cast a net and see who they get. Hopefully they get lucky, but typically they're going to do it in a more targeted fashion. They're going to go after a specific victim. And then once they get that link over to the victim, that victim clicks on it, goes out to the malicious server, gets that response back. The invisible form is going to pull the credentials, right, the session information off of that victim's computer, post it to a legitimate server, in this case, a bank server, okay, the victim's bank. Since the victim's credentials are in fact valid with that bank server, then the attacker will be able to log in or at least hijack that session as if they were the victim and then have access to the bank's databases and be able to do things that the victim themselves would be able to do. So very dangerous if it is in fact able to be carried out successfully. And then just so you understand the differentiation between the two and what the distinctions are, in an XSS attack, a cross-site scripting attack, the browser will run malicious code because it was served from a site that it trusts. All right, so the trust is coming from the server, right? The browser to the server. In a CSRF attack, the server will perform the action because it was sent a request from a client that it trusts. Okay, so you understand the differentiation. In an XSS attack, the browser or the user, right, that their web browser is going to run malicious code because it trusts the web server. In a CSRF attack, the web server is going to perform an action because it trusts the client. All right, so I just want to make sure you understand those key differentiations. Okay, let's talk about application programming interface or API attacks. Now, as you may or may not know, an API is an interface between a person and an application in this case. Just like you might think of a gas pedal in a car being an API, if you will, between a person and an engine. So you don't necessarily need to know how the engine works, and every single car has a different type of engine. All you need to know is how to work the gas pedal. So it's an interface between those two things. An API is very much the same when we're talking about computers and systems and so forth. What you may not know is that they're becoming more and more susceptible to attack. So Gartner states that by 2022, API abuses will move from an infrequent attack to the most frequent attack vector, resulting in data breaches for enterprise web applications and so forth. All right, so what are we talking about specifically? Well, an API attack, as I mentioned, a hostile usage of an API or an application programming interface. And we talked about some of these things previously, but things like injection attacks and denial of service or distributed denial of service attacks, which we'll talk about in the next module. Those types of things can be instantiated via an API attack. Also, authentication hijacking, data exposure is one of the biggest things, one of the biggest risks. And then, of course, man-in-the-middle attacks, which we've talked about previously as well. So these types of things are becoming more and more frequent and will be the most frequent attack vector by 2022, according to Gartner. The other thing to keep in mind is that these traditional methods of protection don't work against application programming attacks, right? These specific types of attacks. Web application firewalls, simple port blocking, and so forth, they don't work anymore because most attackers will not be coming in through a web portal. They'll be coming through an API, which can have any number of different ports available, and they continuously evolve. So APIs, as new functionality is added or a new version is added, those things may change, which result in firewalls needing to be changed and updated and so forth, right? So it's not easy to detect, and it becomes more and more problematic as API usage grows as well.